Hey there! Today I thought I'd go over a few of my favorite pry tricks. Pry is a Ruby REPL, which stands for Read, Execute, Print Loop. It's basically just a kind of like a shell for executing Ruby in a way. You type a Ruby command and it executes it. If you're familiar with IRB, it's the exact same idea. So let's go. First, let's open up Pry. If you've ever used a Ruby REPL before, or any REPL for that matter, this should look pretty familiar to you. We can just type in some Ruby code, hit enter, and it executes. The first line after what I typed is the output of puts, and the nil line is the return from the call. So in the prompt on the left, you'll see main in parentheses, and this main describes the object that we're in. In Pry, this is just kind of the context in which everything is being executed. We can ask what main is, and it's an object. This isn't particularly important, except to note that whenever we execute something in Pry, we're executing it in the context of some kind of object. So if we make a string object, we can change the context that we're in by using the cd method and passing the object that we want to change into. Now we can see the prompt on the left has changed, and if we run self, we get the string foobar back. Once inside this object, if we call a method, we are calling that method on the object that we're inside of, which here is the string foobar. Additionally, we can call ls and get a list of all of the methods. This can come in kind of handy sometimes. We can also get back to the main object just by running cd straight away. Another trick involves executing shell commands. Now in Ruby, we can run shell commands using backticks like so, or by using something like this. But this involves a lot of typing or typing strange characters, and Pry lets us do the exact same thing just by prepending a dot to a line. This can come in handy if you want to just run something in the shell real quick and you don't want to necessarily jump out of Pry. It's also worth noting that the keyboard shortcuts from the shell, Control-R and Control-S to search through your history, work in Pry as well. So if we hit Control-R, it will start a reverse search, and if we start typing, it will try to match backwards to lines that we have run previously. And lastly, inside of Pry, they're not really a trick and not really specific to Pry. I'd like to show something that I often do when I know I'm going to be closing out of a Pry session and then jumping back in, and I want to have some kind of state preserved where I have gems required or lines already run or something like that. So let's look at the simple case of using a string method from active support. Now within the same Pry session, if we rerun this line, classify is still obviously defined. But if we close out of Pry, start it again, and rerun this line, the method is undefined then. This requires us to require active support again, and then the method works. So if I know I'm going to be writing some logic like this in Pry, and then I'm going to close the session, do something in the shell, and then come back into Pry, I'll make life easier on myself by doing the require, semicolon, and then the line I want. This works exactly the same, except that now, when I close out of Pry, jump back in, and rerun that one line, I get the exact same result. This is an admittedly trivial example, but in a case where you had many more requires and more complicated logic, like this, then it makes a lot of sense. That does it for the tricks inside Pry itself, so let's exit for now. But speaking of exiting, there's actually a shortcut for doing this as well. As we just saw, we can run exit to leave Pry, but there's also a keyboard shortcut, and that's Control-D. Outside of Pry itself, there are a couple of tricks involving dot files that Pry uses. The first of which is the .pry history in the home directory. This can be helpful if, after playing around in a pry session, you want to take some of the lines that you ran and put them into a script or a file somewhere. This has been so convenient for me that I've actually made a pry last and pry last 5 command in Vim. These do about what you would expect, dumping the last line from the pry history and the last 5 lines of the pry history, respectively. The other .file is .pryrc, and I think the easiest way to understand how this works is by looking at an example. So if we start at pry and we try to access the variable foo, it's undefined. But if we create a pryrc file and set foo equal to the string bar, save this, close it, start pry back up, and try to get at foo again, we get bar back now. The reason for this is RC stands for run command, and whenever pry starts up, it will look for this .pryrc file to execute first. So if you have anything that you want to be run before a pry session, you can put it in a .pryrc file. Additionally, you can also have a .pryrc file in your home directory. Here we see mine with a dummy hash and a dummy array at the top. I just use this for kind of experimenting with different hash and array methods. And then I also have the pathname method, alias to pn, as I use this very frequently in pry. This last trick is my personal favorite and is really useful for taking a look inside of a script or an application and making use of pry to see exactly what's going on. So as an example, let's take a look at a really simple script that's not behaving the way it should be. Here we're simply assigning a string to a variable named array, and then we're trying to print array.count. Now this error message gives us a line number 5, and if we go look at line number 5, we see that we're calling array.count. Normally, array.count should return the count of the elements in the array. So what's going wrong here? Well, clearly looking at our script here, we can tell that it's because array is a string, but sometimes this isn't very clear. So what would be really convenient would be to use pry here in the space between the array assignment and the call to array.count to find out what's going on. And we can do precisely this by using binding.pry. And to make use of this, we'll also have to require pry above the binding.pry call. So now if we rerun the script, we see this. The code from our broken.rb file, and an arrow pointing at the binding.pry call between the variable assignment and the puts call. And then underneath that, we see we have a pry prompt. Here we can execute arbitrary Ruby, but we also have access to the context in which the binding.pry was executed. This means that we can run array here, and we get back a string. At which point in the debugging process, we realize that though the variable is named array, we have a string instead of an array, and that's why count is failing. This is a simple, contrived example, but this binding.pry is very useful for debugging. For example, I often use this in my Rails controllers to see exactly what kind of parameters and requests I have. So in summary, today we learned in pry we can use cd and ls to change into objects and view their methods, I prepended dot to execute shell commands, Control R to search our pry history from within pry, semicolons to group a bunch of lines together for future use, our .pry history in our home directory to look at our past pry activity, .pryrc both in the project directory and our home directory to pre-execute some Ruby, and finally, binding.pry to debug from within a Ruby application. Well, that's it for today. If you have any questions or episode requests, please comment below or tweet at me at forkbabam. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. And then I also have the pathname method. The other .file is .pryrc, and I think the easiest way to understand this is by looking at an example. So if we start up pry and we try to call a variable foo, and finally binding.pry to binding.pry to